In light of this gospel, and with this being the beginning of the year at the seminary, I remembered my seminary application, which included a self-assessment. The seminarian was to rate himself in various categories and qualities of organization skills or writing and creativity and different types of things. And so it was on a scale of 4. You could be excellent. You could also rate yourself above average or average or needs work. Got that from excellent to needs work. So at the end of the list were 2 blank spots, 2 fill in the blanks. You could rate yourself in some other category that wasn't on the assessment. So I thought, it's be an opportunity to introduce myself to the seminary community. So in the first open spot, I wrote humility. Excellent. And below that I wrote sense of humor. Above average. I'm glad you're laughing because you've already intuited that humility is an interesting quality. Of all of the virtues, I've heard it said, it is the one virtue that as soon as you claim it, you have lost it. So just as we can talk about true and false love, we can talk about true and false humility. And the evil one, the world, the flesh, and the devil, greatly desires to take what is evil and erroneous and call that good and true, and take what is good and true and convince us that that is evil and erroneous. We have to get humility right. So in my humble opinion, where do we go from here? We often get humility wrong because we think that humility, and we'll grow in humility by lowering ourselves. We tell ourselves things like, man, I'm such a sinner. I'm such a klutz. I'm such a fool. But from a scriptural perspective, this errs on the side of actually cursing yourself. But yet we are called to bless, not to curse. So we have to find another way. C.S. Lewis, the great Anglican mind and Christian apologist, in his work Mere Christianity, said humility is not about thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking about yourself less. See the distinction? It's not lowering yourself. It's actually what we would call self-forgetfulness. The more we make a habit of dwelling upon God than ourselves, the more forgetful of ourselves we will become. So, for example, to apply this, when we have sinned, instead of just stopping at, man, I am such a sinner, I have sinned, we can say, I have sinned, but look at what Jesus has done for me that far outweighs the consequences of my sin. Sometimes we think that to accept praise, to acknowledge a gift that God has given us, is to fall into pride. But again, that is another sort of false humility. Saint Therese lived at the turn of the last century, a Carmelite nun, cloistered. And when you live in an enclosed environment, like I do at the seminary, one of the challenges is little things become big things pretty quick. And when you live in the same environment where you work and play and everything else, then everyone's up in everyone's business. And one day, there was a sister who approached Saint Therese, who was in the company of another sister. And the sister just kind of flying by said, oh, sister, great work on that thing earlier, setting the table for the meal or cleaning the kitchen, whatever it was, great job. It looks great in there. And she said, oh, thank you very much. And as that sister walked away, the sister who was overhearing this says, Sister Therese, I am very concerned. I think you have fallen into pride. You didn't even try at once to dismiss the praise that you received. Now, how many of us do that? But Saint Therese, known for her doctrine, the little way, doing great doing small things with great love, responded with that spiritual childlikeness, who simply said, "Oh, sister, I know I don't deserve any praise, but if the good Lord still chooses to praise me, who am I to refuse it?" Definitely something to ponder. Another saint, Saint Teresa of Avila, said, "Humility is seeing yourself as God sees you, nothing more and nothing less." This is so important to distinguish between true and false humility, because we often recognize that pride is a violation of humility, but fail to recognize that on the other side of the coin, we fail to honor humility when we consider it humiliation, to see ourselves as less than we are. So when we hear that we are called to be saints, we can think that we're being proud and presumptuous. But let me ask you, why did God create you? Did he create you to go to hell or to heaven? What does it mean to be a saint? Can you be a saint forever and not be in heaven? No. The consequences of not being a saint are the most tragic. We're not talking about a canonized saint. We're talking about living in and abiding in the abundance of God's divine life in holiness, in this life and the next. And if you forego on the call to holiness and fail to own your vocation to become a saint, there's only one other eternal option for you. And sometimes we can think that being a saint is too hard. And if we're in that camp, then that demonstrates we have some presumptions to work on. It means that we don't yet understand that holiness is more about what God has done and is doing for me than what I do for God. You are already a saint by virtue of your baptism. God has washed you clean and adopted you as his beloved son or daughter, which makes you an heir to his kingdom. This is why the evil one so greatly wants you to misunderstand humility and holiness, because you are called to become a saint, which means you're called to become what you already are in the order of grace and sacramentally, if you're baptized. And St. Catherine of Siena said, "Become who you are, and you will set the world on fire." And the devil does not want that to happen. It is false humility to say that being a saint is beyond me. In fact, we would place ourselves right with the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 12, where the people referred to in Exodus 19 were in fear and trembling. And as we heard, tragically said, "We don't want to hear the voice of God anymore. We can't take it. It's too much for us. It would overwhelm us." But we do the same thing when we are tasked to share the good news and to evangelize and to serve and to own our vocation to become saints. And we say, "No, Lord, that is too much for me. I can't handle it. I'm too wretched of a person. I don't have those talents. I don't have that confidence." And we say, "Speak to me no more of the vocation of holiness. Don't ever remind me that I'm called to be a saint, because I've already believed the lie that I'm going to stay right where I am. And that's the best that I can do. And God will be happy with that." It is a cop-out of false humility. What the people in Exodus 19 failed to realize, that even in the midst of awesome truths and revelations, we have to trust that the grace is sufficient to make that happen. And if that is the Lord's will, he will provide the grace. So where can be the middle way? When we are torn between the greatness of our calling and the reality of our divided heart and the sins we're still working through, whatever the case may be, maybe we can take St. Teresa of Avila's wisdom to heart and say, Jesus, help me become the saint you are calling me to be, no greater and no less. This resists the temptation of pride to be greater than God's plan for our life, but it also resists the temptations to humiliation to settle for less than is God's plan for my life. So just as we come to a close, what does this look like in practice? Again, everyone's pretty humble until someone sits in our seat. Everyone's pretty humble until someone parks in our spot. Everyone's pretty humble until that person gets the promotion or the trophy that I thought I deserved. And you know what? Maybe you did. But what are you going to do in here, in your heart? And what are you going to do in your words and actions? Well, imagine one day in a church, the priest was praying and the music minister was ministering and the church handyman was working on one of the lights. And the priest in his prayer was overcome by just this fervor. And he came to the front of the church and he threw himself on the ground and he proclaimed, Lord, I am nothing. The music minister heard this and was like, well, I'm not going to be outdone here. And came forward and said, Lord, I am nothing. And the handyman overhearing this too didn't want to miss out on this litany and came forward and said, Lord, I am nothing. And the priest tapped on the music minister and said, look who thinks he's nothing. How do we avoid all of the pitfalls in practice? Well, I want to give you a tool, and the tool is one truth with two parts. Something I want you to cling to. You can memorize this. It's only one line. But think about what your life would look like if you clinged to this statement. I am the least of all and the greatest of sinners. Now, as I say that, I want you to listen to your heart and I want you to hear whatever response you just had. When I say that you need to cling to the truth that you are the least of all and the greatest of sinners, what happens? Initially, you may think, that can't be right. That doesn't apply to me. I can think of a lot of greater sinners. That's too extreme. But let me qualify it for you. We are the least of all properly understood because there's nothing we have that was not given, even our very existence. God has created you, and you only continue to exist because God is upholding the whole world, including you at this moment. We are the least of all. And the greatest of sinners, so Father, that's too far. Look at the headlines. Wake up. My sins are nowhere as great as others. But let's get back to some catechesis and theology. What do you need to have access to be able to know one's conscience? Which is a prerequisite for naming sin. What must you know? You must have direct access to the mind and to the heart. And tell me, how many minds and hearts do you have direct access to? Only one. Yours. So in a certain sense, you are the greatest sinner you know because you are the only sinner you know. Which is why Jesus always tells us to start here. And as that little joke was about, we look to others and compare and puff ourselves up because we're more humble than the next person, and we don't even realize that we've already lost it. So this week, I want to encourage you to reflect on these truths. And I apologize if you're like, man, I was really hoping to hear about the gospel today, and Father Kevin just kind of talked a lot about humility and such. But here's my point. I'm doing the groundwork, hopefully, to reaffirm the foundation and uproot the lies. Because if we get humility wrong, it doesn't matter how much more we talk about the virtue of it, we've already lost it. Humility is everything. If we get that wrong, we get everything wrong. So what I would direct you to do for your own reflection and prayer, go to the New Testament, to the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. And there's a beautiful hymn praising Jesus' humble self-emptying as a model for us to follow. And again, ask yourself, what would my life look like if I took that to heart? What would my life look like if we followed the admonition in Philippians 2 to humbly regard others as more important than ourselves? What would my life look like, my thoughts, my attitudes, and my actions, if I clung to the truth that I am the least of all and the greatest of sinners? God loves you. God is calling you to be a saint because he has already made you a saint by baptism. And this Eucharist we are here to share is to increase, to fan into flame the gift of divine life we have already received. So, my friends, in all truth and humility, strive to be the saint and to receive all of the holiness God is offering you, nothing more and nothing less. Jesus seems to have gone off the script a little bit as the Prince of Peace, saying that he came not to bring peace, but rather division. So what is Jesus trying to say? What type of division is he speaking of? Well, let me give you an example that you may have already experienced, or you may one day experience. In fact, it might be today. It's a division that usually enters through one member of the household. Maybe it is a student who attends religious ed, or youth group, or the fellowship of Christian athletes at school, or they just came back from a summer trip and they're on fire. And they learn something new, something about God, something about their identity, and they want to bring it into the home. Or maybe it comes through the mother or father. Maybe challenged at one of the Sunday masses, maybe listening to Christian radio or a Christian podcast. They hear about what some other family is doing to live out their faith, and they say, honey, I'd like to do something different. You know, from time to time, parishes have changes. Have you ever experienced that? Now, by the way, I know nothing of your history, but I just have worked in parish work for 12 years. And sometimes in parish work, the pastor wants to make a change. It's like, well, and there can be division. Maybe it comes to the grandparents. Maybe after 25 or even 50 years of marriage, you want to try something new. And the division is identified and immediately resisted. Well, why now? Well, so God did something in your life that he didn't do in mine, so he loves you more than me? What makes you so special? Oh, you think you're better than me because you want to step things up a notch. And there will be division. Jesus came to set the world on fire. And how great is his anguish until it is accomplished. First and foremost, we need to make sure that when that fire is being kindled in others, that we do not seek to quench it. Maybe listen for the voice of the Holy Spirit speaking to all of us. There can be a center of our marriage and a center of our families that we didn't even know was there, that is giving a peace that the world gives, but not the peace that Jesus came to bring. And I think it's summarized well by one of Pope Benedict's lines. He says, "You were not made for comfort. You were made for greatness." And so many times, without even realizing it, we are conditioned by the world, seeking comfort, convenience, and complacency. And the world will offer peace, You have a problem, you have a pain, there's a pill or a pillow for that. Think of how many advertisements are all about increasing your pleasure and decreasing your pain. And lo and behold, in our comfort, the slightest pain can sometimes be unbearable. Rather than being grateful for what we have, we seek the next technology, the next flashy thing, or creaturely comfort. Or we immediately seek to numb that pain in one way or another. But you were made for greatness. Sometimes we can think that the greatest pain is a physical one. But the greatest pain that we can experience is existential. We heard from Jeremiah and from Jesus today, and I think that we can see an anticipation of Jesus' anguish in Jeremiah's own words. In Jeremiah chapter 20, beginning with verse 9, he says, because, by the way, like we heard in today's first reading, he is being persecuted for being a prophet of the Lord, and he's suffering for it. Lashes, or imprisonment, or just being isolated. And he says, if I say to myself, if I say, I will not mention him or speak his name anymore, there is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary holding it in, and I cannot. So there were moments where Jeremiah even sought to say, you know what, I'm going to give up this whole prophet gig. It's not worth it. The pay's not that great. You lose all your friends and you're hated by everyone. I'll just give that up. And as he's taking a step away from that vocation to greatness and fidelity to the Lord, that fire burns once more. And he cannot ignore it, and he cannot suppress it. And so he returns to prophecy with all of the inconvenience that it brings. Because the greatest suffering we can experience is existential suffering, is suffering that comes from our very being, of a spiritual nature. We were made in the image of a God who is love. That kind of love. And for times we can ignore it, we can forget it maybe, we can try to suppress it, but you know the one moment we cannot ignore it? If we have the grace of having our awareness of our impending death, when there's no more life to live and all we can do is look back and ask, did I fulfill my purpose? Did I come to live the greatness that God was calling me to live? Or did I take the easy route of comfort, convenience, complacency? Was I the one who was trying to rekindle a fire in myself and in my family and in my community? Or was I the one who was trying to squash it to maintain the status quo? Well, I have good news for you. There's a medicine if you're not in touch with that fire today. It's a medicine that Jesus knows we need, which is why it is a commandment not to be done out of duty, but out of desire. But sometimes we forget how much we need the Lord, so we need it to be a commandment to keep us close to him. And that is to come here at least once a week before his blessed sacrament, and in word and sacrament, to expose ourselves to his fire, that the fire in us can be rekindled. I want you to think about this past week, and if it was defined by greatness. And again, please understand, I can look back at plenty of my weeks, even recently, and go, yeah, I could have done a better job with that. Could have been more faithful. Could have been more fervent. But I also want you to consider this upcoming week and how this week can be just a little bit different. With your spouse, with yourself, with your children, I challenge you to have a conversation this week. Has there been a devotion or a practice, some time when you wanted for yourself or for others to make the center of your relationship not comfort and convenience, but to make the Lord more of the center? And where can we revisit that and maybe try it again? Something as simple as more family dinners without the TV. Maybe a daily devotional in the morning, or prayer before nighttime, or praying before meals. Whatever the case is, we have to keep this fire burning of fidelity to the Lord, faithful to that anguish that Jesus wants to set the whole world ablaze and wants you to be a torch in his hand to do that very thing, beginning with yourself, those closest to you, and the world around us that is in anguish and doesn't even know how much they are longing for him. And I encourage us as we are here gathered today to make our prayer not, Lord, spare me from suffering, but Lord, give me such an ardent, burning fire of your love in my heart that any other suffering will pale by comparison. Lord, reignite the flame of your love in my heart that I have received by virtue of my baptism, and set my heart ablaze so that you can use me to set the world ablaze.